Hey Asher, I recall meeting you at a presentation that you gave in Sydney, Australia on wild animal suffering around 6 years ago. So what have you been up to since then?
Yeah, so that was a presentation I gave on behalf of Animal Ethics, the international nonprofit that does some work on wild animal suffering. Since then, I started a PhD, and I'm just in the process of finishing the PhD. Just yesterday, I came to a first complete draft of my thesis, but I've also been doing a lot of other things along the way. So last year, I was working for a neurotech startup in Barcelona, and yeah, we were looking at new models of understanding brain aging. I've also been doing some collaborative work with the Qualia Research Institute, so looking at like modeling phenomenal consciousness and phenomenology, and then just writing lots of papers, including the paper that I guess I'll be talking about relating to directed panspermia, which was the result of meeting Anders and yeah, having a productive conversation about it.
There's a lot of different stuff that you've worked on, and I can kind of see the common thread. But in your own words, what is there a common thread that you see that binds all those different pieces of work together?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, my main interest, I guess, since before I started studying philosophy in my undergraduate was, reducing suffering, regardless of who it is that suffers, or, trying to do good better, the classic effective altruist kind of motivation. And yeah, as my studies have progressed, I've become more and more convinced that it's really important that we understand, I guess, like not only what are the factors or the circumstances that are correlated with suffering, but what is suffering intrinsically, like within our models of objective reality. And I think we have to account for what is consciousness in order to answer that question, given that suffering or valence more broadly is a property of phenomenal consciousness. So yeah, in my thesis work and in some other work, I've been like really focusing on looking at when did sentience evolve in the phylogenetic history of life, how can we make inferences about which organisms or which kinds of systems could be capable of suffering or could have subjective experiences. These are kind of questions that I think are taken seriously, but certainly not at the level that I think is necessary in order to actually answer them, and I do think they have answers. So yeah, mostly prioritizing that.
Yeah, those are big, hefty, and important topics, but we'll leave those aside for today and assume those are all solved for now. So I'm keen to talk about directed panspermia. What is directed panspermia?
Yeah, so directed panspermia is essentially the deliberate spreading or transfer of life between planets by intelligent actors. And so it's kind of related to the panspermia hypothesis, which is an explanation for the origins of terrestrial life. But yeah, like I guess it's a particular type of explanation because it would posit there being intelligent extraterrestrials that were responsible for for humans or just for life on Earth. But in the context of, I guess, my paper and also modern discussion about directed panspermia, people talk about it as something that humans ourselves could accomplish, given the technology that we have available to us right now, or that are predicted to exist in the near term future. Um, and yeah, I think it's important because potentially it has astronomical, kind of scale consequences. So
Yeah. How did you come to work on this topic? I know that you worked on a paper with Anders Sandberg.
yeah, yeah. So I was about, I was going to say 2 years ago, but now I guess it would be 3 years ago. I was doing a visitation at the Uhiro Centre for Practical Ethics in Oxford. This was like shortly after COVID, and yeah, got to fly over and participate in lots of kind of local university activities and events. And there was a seminar series on animal ethics that the university was hosting at the Natural History Museum. They asked me to come and do an introduction to animal ethics. It was meant to be, kind of for all ages, so it was like very introductory. And yeah, like the next speaker after me was Anders, and he was giving a talk about insect ethics. And so I was really excited because I've been a fan of his work for quite a few years at that point, and sent him an email, and then yeah, we kind of met up and had an awesome conversation. And I guess the key thing to note would be he's an optimist about the long-term future of, I guess, humanity, but also the universe, and is somewhat optimistic about spreading life to other planets. I'm a bit more pessimistic. So as I mentioned before, I've done a lot of work on wild animal suffering, and I'm not convinced that natural evolutionary processes tend in a direction that is optimized for the well-being of sentient organisms. And so yeah, I'm kind of I'm not entirely opposed to it, but I think that we have to seriously consider, the potential for suffering risks, for astronomical levels of suffering to result from these actions. So we had a conversation about it and had different views, and then we decided to write a paper together to come to a synthesis of our views.
Yeah, I love that. That's everyone should do that if they have a disagreement, I think.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Anders Sandberg, I'm probably some people who are watching would know who Anders is. He's quite well known in effective altruism circles. But he, as I understand it, is more in the Nick Bostrom cosmic endowment camp of, there's this great opportunity to spread life to other planets. And we're sort of wasting the burning of stars by not spreading life or sentience, at least maybe through digital sentience
Mm.
to throughout the galaxy, throughout the universe. Is that more or less a fair representation?
Yeah, so I guess, he and Nick and a few others, were kind of founding members of the Future of Humanity Institute, which, unfortunately just closed recently. I got to go while I was in Oxford and kind of spend quite a bit of time there and participate in some discussions. And it was really fascinating. And that is definitely a trend in, I guess, their research trajectories, looking at, the especially existential risks. So Nick Bostrom has an astronomical waste argument, I think from a paper he published in 2003, where he kind of makes the case that if you take into account the potential aggregated value of our future light cone, and the future light cone describes, all regions in space time that are causally, kind of affectable from, a point in the present. He makes the case that, yeah, we should be like reducing existential risk, and then also trying to kind of, fulfill, I guess, our potential, given how much value could exist in the long term future. Of course, this depends on the point at which we're observing this dilemma being quite early in the history of the universe. Those arguments might not hold at if there wasn't much time left over. There will be a certain point due to the universe's continual expansion where we actually won't be able to causally affect very much. So the future light cone is slowly narrowing over time. But yeah, that's something that I guess Nick and Anders have historically focused on. I think Nick has written a bit about digital sentience, and Anders also maybe talked about this in some podcasts, and maybe has some writings about it. But often I don't think it's framed as sentience per se. I think often they're doing kind of work on potential spreading of, I guess, like patterns that might be like considered equivalent to sentience, or to consciousness. Um, but yeah, might not depend upon like physical systems being organized in a particular way, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Sort of, but maybe we'll move on just for time. So we will come back to whether the idea of directed panspermia is a net good, net bad. Talk about the pros and cons, but just for now. So you mentioned earlier that directed panspermia comes from the idea of panspermia, which is that life may have naturally or perhaps unnaturally arrived on Earth from another source, and that's where life came from on Earth. So, look, conspiracy theories aside, is that at least plausible that life may have come to Earth from somewhere else?
Yeah, so it's certainly taken seriously by the astrobiology community. I mean, it's a controversial explanation just for this, I guess like many, perhaps most explanations for the origin of terrestrial life are somewhat controversial because we have such limited information that we can use to make inferences about what happened some nearly 4 billion years ago, when it seems that these physical processes kind of kickstarted or catalyzed. Um, but yeah, it's certainly. I mean, it's been considered for even thousands of years. So I think the first recorded mention of panspermia was from a Greek philosopher, Anaxagoras, and he had a hypothesis for seeds falling from the heavens onto Earth. But then the first physical mechanism that was proposed for potential panspermia was from I think a Swedish scientist, Svante Arrhenius, and he had this notion of bacterial spores spreading between planets due to light pressure. Kind of modern discussions about panspermia primarily look at the possibility of meteor impacts, so bacterial spores surviving hypervelocity impact scenarios, which there's also some empirical evidence demonstrating that this could be the case, or potentially microorganisms surviving within the kind of liquid core of large asteroids, and like large meaning like many kilometers across. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean the notion of just material going from one planet to another is, I mean, we know that there are rocks on Earth that have come from Mars, and we can, identify these rocks and say with some accuracy that they're from Mars, blasted into space on Mars by an impact of some kind, and then eventually ended up on Earth. So, I mean, specifically from Mars, is it plausible that maybe life originated earlier on Mars and it ended up on Earth, and then is now no longer on Mars?
It could be the case. So I don't have extensive knowledge about this, but my understanding is there was a time when Mars had an atmosphere and had a magnetic shield, and potentially, I mean, I guess we'd have to do empirical kind of data collection on Mars itself to be able to see the likelihood or assess the likelihood of this. But I mean, in principle, yes. It could have also come from. I mean, it'd be more difficult for it coming from outside of the solar system, but like theoretically, it could have. Yeah, I think we just it's there's lots of possibilities, and we just don't have enough data to be able to like reason properly about the potential origins. If this hypothesis is taken seriously.
Yeah, fair enough. Would there be any way to tell just by looking at the DNA or genome of any given life on Earth that it may have come from life may have had an extra terrestrial origin? Could there be something that you might expect to see? Maybe not now, but could we come to that conclusion just based on looking at life itself on Earth?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I don't have I think, a technical response about like what exact kinds of patterns we should be looking at. But I think maybe to like a first approximation, you could say that if we have a model of biological evolution or the the mechanics of biological evolution, so how does life evolve over the course of multiple generations, and then say we discover a pattern like a biomolecular pattern within an existing form of organic life that we already have access to, or maybe we discover something under permafrost or something like that in a crater from a meteor, and we see a pattern that doesn't fit our model, and the model basically predicting what kinds of patterns we should see, are the result of kind of given our understanding of like the laws of physics and how biology, I guess, like recruits physics in order to create replicating patterns over time. So if we found a pattern that didn't fit that model, then we'd either have to update our model of how kind of natural organic evolution unfolds, or we'd have to come up with an alternative explanation. And then I guess an alternative explanation would be, well, it's kind of comes from a different planet, or it's not to say that it doesn't obey the laws of physics, but it could be to say that the way in which, say, organic systems, like metabolic pathways, how do systems extract and utilize energy, this could be very different on different planets with different atmospheres or with different like nutrients available. And yeah, if we found those kinds of patterns on Earth, then that could serve as evidence of, oh wow, this looks more adapted to very different conditions than we would predict at any given point in the history of Earth.
Mm. Yep. So the whole idea of panspermia, whether directed or not, relies on the idea that biological life in some form can survive interstellar journeys, or at least interplanetary journeys. So can you talk to that a little bit, a bit more before we get to how directed panspermia would work per se? Because if we were fairly confident that that's just not possible, then I guess that would mean that directed panspermia is not possible. So what do we know about whether it's possible for life to travel from one star system to another?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, there is some empirical evidence suggesting that bacteria can survive hypervelocity impact scenarios, which would, make the likelihood of, inoculated comets, or it would make this like a viable explanation for panspermia scenarios. But as for directed panspermia, if you have an intelligent civilization that's, producing pansperms, so producing these payloads that are full of microorganisms to be spread, there are various different ways in which you could shield the bacteria or the microorganisms from, say, just the background radiation in the universe. So you could freeze dry the bacteria. You could have these, put them in pellets, and there are lots of different mechanisms that have been proposed where they could theoretically survive for like millions of years in transit, because ultimately these are massive distances, especially if we're considering outside or between different solar systems. And yeah, it's it would depend on, I guess, whatever mechanisms recruited.
Mm. Is there an upper limit to how long DNA could survive without being deteriorated in interstellar, or just in general? I guess. I mean that because I can imagine maybe that even with the best preservation, there's still some small deterioration, and that might put an upper bound on the range of panspermia. Does that make sense? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I would say that this applies especially in the case of complex life, and this is kind of why I'm not so concerned about like larger organisms being spread, like fish on Mars or something like that. I don't think that's as pressing as the possibility of really simple organisms, because simple organisms are essentially just like very simple, biochemical patterns or biomolecular patterns. Um, and complex organisms require, like, if one part of it fails, then the whole system can cease functioning. And so maybe even with like microorganisms, maybe like most microorganisms might deteriorate, or crucial components might cease functioning that would stop panspermia from happening as I've described. But some of them I think certainly can. I mean, there's evidence of, what is it, tardigrades that have accidentally survived on the moon from lunar missions in the past. And I mean, ultimately, I think that, like, life finds a way. Life is a very hardy, resistant pattern that's literally had billions of years to optimize itself to survive in a variety of different harsh environments. And, like, yeah, the vacuum of space is maybe more harsh than most conditions, or any conditions we could find on Earth. But the fact that, like, we've tried to sterilize existing space equipment, and already some of them have still survived, or there's evidence that they haven't died. I think if we're intentional about protecting them, we should assume that it's possible.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know if that was intentional, but I liked the Jurassic Park reference slipped in there. Okay, let's talk about directed panspermia. So, if someone wanted to, there were, we'll get to the ethics in a moment, but if someone was convinced that it's a good idea to send life to other stars, other planetary systems throughout the galaxy or beyond, what would they do? How would this actually work?
Yeah, so if they wanted to do it, I mean, still at the moment, even though I personally believe it's technologically feasible, it would require substantial investment just to get the infrastructure in place. I kind of think that it's a case of, once you have the infrastructure, how many times you attempt it, you kind of, there's a, what do you call, economies of scale kind of factor at play, because, ultimately, the size of the pansperms might be like less than a kilogram, or even smaller. And then, depending on the technology that's used to propel them, we could use lasers from Earth or solar sails for the cargo when they're in space. And then there are mechanisms proposed, such as magnetic braking or thermal expansion, to release the spores, by nearby planets. Um, like, I think it's possible. I don't think there's any obvious evidence of anyone actually attempting it. One thing I will say that has me kind of quite concerned is that Anders had an interview recently on Spencer Greenberg's podcast, and at the end of it, they were talking about this paper that we're writing, and Spencer mentioned that he knew someone, like a multimillionaire, or someone with, like, extraordinary access to resources, who is actively trying to work on this. So I'm trying to kind of figure out who they might be, because I would like to talk to them, and hopefully, kind of, yeah, the point of the paper, and I think the point of my advocacy efforts, is just trying to kind of make people aware of the potential consequences, given that
Hmm.
it's potentially a permanent action. If we attempt it now, it's going to be difficult, next to impossible, depending on where we're launching the pansperms, to interfere at a later date, if we have access to, say, some future knowledge about how we could have it, life unfold in exoplanets in a way that's maybe, like, more optimized for well-being, or yeah.
I want to come back to all of that, but let's come back just for now to the I guess how directed panspermia would work. So, I mean, because you mentioned the relative lightness of the cargo, you could in theory have many different payloads you send to many different stars, or multiple payloads per star.
Yeah.
So, I guess could you talk a little bit more about how that makes it potentially easier just if you just send enough, eventually one will survive. Yeah, you talk about that. Just increase the
Yep.
number of attempts.
Yeah, so I mean that's ultimately I think the problem with directed panspermia is that it seems that the likelihood of any given attempt is really small. Any given attempt being successful, but because once you've developed the infrastructure to be able to build these cargo and to be able to launch them, whatever mechanisms you're recruiting in order to do that, it would be relatively trivial just to kind of multiply by 1,000 or 10,000 or even like by millions, and just send them toward exoplanets that like we already have the potential to detect the atmospheric conditions on nearby exoplanets and neighboring solar systems, especially with like the James Webb Telescope and increasing sensing capacities that we're developing. And so yeah, like sending them in those directions. There's also a lot of discussion about potentially engineering, say, like resistance of various microorganisms to radiation beyond what they already have. That could enable them to survive the journey, and many more of them would be intact. Or maybe even optimize microorganisms to survive on particular exoplanets, given the local conditions, because they're plausibly quite different from Earth. So yeah, all of these things could come together and yeah, kind of create I think quite a high likelihood. As I mentioned before, ultimately we can't actually determine what that likelihood is. To be able to determine the likelihood, we'd actually have to do it because that's the only way we could get the information. So given that it seems plausible, given our understanding of the difficulty of sending small matter through interstellar space, I think it's reasonable to assume that with enough attempts, we should assume that it's possible.
Hmm. Yeah, the thought that comes to my mind is I'm thinking about what does the second half of the trip look like. So we've talked about sending them there, but on the other end, I mean, even if you could identify stars with exoplanets that look like they have atmosphere, and you send directed payloads to those stars, are we? Is it? I ultimately, if you just increase the number of attempts enough, it doesn't really matter. But is it likely that you could, on the other end, target a particular planet, or is that just is that not really feasible? But you send enough to the system, that star system, that some make it to that planet, or is it likely that they'll survive entry to the planet, atmospheric entry? Do you have thoughts on the second half of the journey? I suppose.
Yeah, so I think getting there is probably going to be the hardest part because once you have say a kilogram payload, as I mentioned before, it's not like that itself would need to kind of go land on a particular planet and you'd need to aim perfectly. All it would have to do is kind of get within proximity to maybe a cluster of planets, or even just like a single planet, and then you could have like have trillions of microorganisms come out in much smaller pellets that it contains. And you could have like a timed release system. As I mentioned before, you could have thermal expansion, so it could detect nearby stars, which we might want to assume are probably necessary in order for the conditions to be right for life to potentially take hold on certain exoplanets. So yeah, you can have mechanisms, many of which don't even depend on like having electronic components that are sensing and kind of like opening and closing gates or latches. You could actually just have very basic analog mechanisms that would detect when the time is right, and then it could just like release all of them at once. And then so long as like even like so long as 1 in 10,000 reaches the intended destination intact, that's all it takes really, because life, as I mentioned, is a pattern that wants to persist and is very efficient at replicating itself through time in a wide variety of different circumstances. So
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Makes sense. Yeah. So let's talk about the ethical case for directed panspermia now. So I guess let's start with the case four. So I'm aware that there are someone who might take a life maximizing view might, for that reason, be in support of directed panspermia. There might be more just classical utilitarian cases for directed panspermia, or trying to reduce the likelihood that life goes extinct. If you think life on Earth might be the only life in the galaxy or the universe. So yeah, what's the strongest case you can make for the case for directed panspermia? And yeah, maybe let's break that down a little bit.
Yeah, so I think I guess there are two kinds of arguments that we could consider that would count as, strong cases, and both of them we consider in the paper. One of them, or both, would be biocentric in nature, which is basically a broad ethical view about what has intrinsic value or what has ethical value. And so these theories would say, all and only life has ethical value. And then one of them we can imagine that would probably be the strongest impetus for attempting directed panspermia would say, all right, we should just seek to maximize how much life the universe contains. And then obviously directed panspermia is an efficient, method of, maximizing, how much life there is, because there are, even on Earth, where life has existed for billions of years, there are natural limits on, just like there are finite resources, and eventually, once all of the niches get, kind of taken up by existing life, then you get interesting kind of like biodiversity, and you find different lineages or different organisms will evolve different modes of exploiting energy from their environment and competing with one another. But it's far more efficient just to kind of if you want to maximize how much life there is, just to send it to another planet where you can have two planets that contain life, or two biospheres, and then four, and then however much. So there's that view. I think the reasons for accepting this view are the weakest, even though it's technically the strongest case for attempting directed panspermia. We also discuss that in the paper. But then a more commonly accepted view is the life conserving view, and that's kind of more in line with kind of conventional, conservationism or environmentalism, which is to say that we have duties more toward preserving or protecting existing life than we do to creating new life. And then from this view, I guess whether or not we should attempt directed panspermia depends on, what is the ubiquity of life throughout the universe, and also what is the value of terrestrial life given the unique patterns or the biodiversity that we have on our planet already relative to whatever exists out there. So to the extent of our knowledge, Earth is the only planet with life. We've been trying to detect life for hundreds of or thousands of years, arguably, but maybe only like hundreds of years using modern kind of technology, and we can't find it. And so this would also support the case for directed panspermia, not because new planets or new biospheres are intrinsically worthwhile, but because currently we have all of our value, and I guess in one big egg in one basket. I'm not sure if I'm using the metaphor correctly, but
Yeah.
if something happened on Earth, then all of the value potentially of the universe could be extinguished if Earth is the only planet in the universe that hosts life. And because we have no way of knowing what is the actual ubiquity of life, then surely we should, kind of hedge against something happening on Earth. I mean, Earth itself has a finite lifespan, or at least like a finite amount of time where life will be stable, because eventually, the sun will turn into a red dwarf. And then there are probably things that would happen before then that would endanger life. Like we already know from looking at the geological record that mass extinctions are really common. And so, if one happens in the future and wipes out everything, then yeah, that's bad from the biocentric perspective. So
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like that's like more or less an existential risk reduction argument. Is that right?
yeah, to some extent. I mean, I think most people who would advocate for reducing extinction risk or existential risk would be more about, kind of like looking at potential causes that exist in the present, like AGI, or kind of whatever other potentially preventable causes that are kind of endangering the existence of humanity. This is kind of more broadly like looking at, I mean, it would be classified as an existential risk, but it's looking at potential threats to Earth being able to host life, like just as a matter of like other conditions, right? And they have been right for billions of years, but they won't be, as I said before, Earth will have a finite kind of period of being able to host life. And so yeah, it's another way of mitigating extinction risk, but specifically for the existence of life in the universe, not just the existence of humanity or whatever species we identify with.
Yeah. Yeah. One case for that I don't think I heard from you actually was, which is the one I was expecting, was just that if we think that life tends to be net positive from a classical hedonic utilitarian perspective, I think people who talk about wild animal suffering have a different view on average. But if you thought that wild animal life just tended to be, wild animals tended to have more pleasure than suffering, uh, or that you think that this is going to lead to more intelligent life and that they're going to have more pleasure than suffering, uh, then directed panspermia increases the amount of positive life in the universe. I mean, if you have the different view, then uh, it can increase the amount of net suffering in the universe as well. But is that an argument that people put forward in favor of directed panspermia?
Yeah, so I guess it would depend on, if you're a classical utilitarian, like a, hedonist about well-being. So for one, you'd have to ask what kinds of living systems are capable of having, valence experiences. So then we can, once we have the scope of, okay, what kinds of entities should we be looking at, and looking at their average conditions, then you can kind of make that assessment. I would argue that even if you extend it beyond animals, even if you include plants, we just don't have enough research looking at the conditions under which positive and negative hedonic states come into existence, to be able to make that claim or support that claim. So I guess the claim that I would defend regarding suffering risks doesn't come from like holding a view that life is net negative or sentient life is net negative under natural conditions. It's just really a position of uncertainty. And yeah, I would kind of argue this position. If someone kind of put forward this view of life is on average, creates more positive hedonic or just generally positive welfare states in the universe, it's unclear. We haven't actually investigated this.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let's talk about the case against. And so that last one, does that sounds kind of like a precautionary principle, I guess. Is that more or less right? And what other cases against directed panspermia are there?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess it's the precautionary principle. Yes, would apply. I think in this case, especially because, as I mentioned before, depending on how we attempt directed panspermia, so that the cheapest methods are probably going to be the ones that are the most difficult to reverse. Because if you think about, say, we launch 1,000 pansperms toward a nearby solar system that might have suitable exoplanets, we're going to have to design them adding extra components that could malfunction, to create a kill switch or to do something that would alter the course or their trajectories. And even if we did that, even if we like managed to put them off course, who's to say that in 10 billion years they don't just like randomly stumble across conditions where life could still take hold. So there's that argument from epistemic uncertainty. There are also, I guess, a variety of different arguments that are kind of more conventionally associated with utilitarianism regarding, as I mentioned before, wild animal suffering, and this, the natural state or dynamics of well-being on our own planet. So, like, kind of two circumstances that I think are quite important and often discussed in the context of wild animal welfare research is, you know, there are scarce resources in natural ecosystems, and this is something we should expect. For any planet, there are finite numbers of resources that could be converted into energy, for organisms to reproduce. And then there are evolutionary processes, and that results from different organic patterns, different organisms competing for that energy, and then there being selection pressures or filters that determine what kinds of patterns will survive or are going to be more or less successful at getting this energy in order to replicate themselves. And in response to that, because as I mentioned before, ecosystems have finite resources, and after enough time, if you have life within an ecosystem with lots of resources that could be converted into energy, then you've reached the carrying capacity of that environment. And then, yeah, I guess there are different pressures that will come into effect. The most common of them being just increasing the numbers of offspring that an organism reproduces. So every time they replicate themselves, rather than having what's often considered a K-selected strategy of having few offspring and investing in traits that would increase the survival chances of each individual offspring. It's vastly more common under natural conditions just to have tens of thousands of offspring and to kind of try and maximize your chances of your genes being passed on to future generations. So this is kind of what we see in nature already. And if you look at the history of terrestrial life, most animals reproduce using the second strategy of maximizing what's called fecundity. So the physiologically maximum amount of offspring an organism can produce over the course of their life. And humans are, we obviously follow this different strategy of we have maternal care and social bonds, and typically we have long lives, and we don't face high rates of premature mortality. So I think we have a biased perspective of what is the average quality of life of a sentient being, in the world. But if we want to actually answer that question, we have to kind of look outside of our perspective as large mammals, specifically primates, who do care for each other and have evolved these, kind of like unusual and usually unstable strategies on a evolutionary timescale.
Yeah, yeah. I mean the whole wild animal suffering argument I came across in 2015. I think it was Brian Tomasik's one of his classic papers on that, which that was quite a perspective shift for me. And I'll throw up a link to that in the show notes. There's also this other concern, which I think I take less seriously, even as someone who is against doing directed panspermia now, which is that you might interfere with other planets that already have life, even if they don't have intelligent life. If some planet somewhere already has life, and we interfere with our own life, some people use this as an argument against further colonization or terraforming of Mars.
Mm.
That if it turns out that Mars already had some life, or if it had some fossil record of life, then we just shouldn't contaminate it. Uh, but then that somehow contaminating the moon would be less bad or okay. I mean, I don't find that particularly compelling. But I think if that was your concern, I guess you could perhaps target young star systems in particular, which less will be less likely to have life on them. But I mean, I get the impression that's less of a concern for you too. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, so this has definitely been raised. I think Gary O'Brien might mention it in his paper, and certainly Oscar de Sevilla has also written about directed panspermia, and he focuses more on looking at kind of non-welfareist objections or reasons, why we should attempt it. And yeah, there's the risk of so interfering with local biota if there is life. Of course, it's unclear at this stage given we have limited sensing capacities. But yeah, as you mentioned, you could take steps if that's your concern to mitigate that risk. Some people also have concerns about, or are not strictly biocentrists, but would say that there's an intrinsic value in there just being like natural landscapes or natural conditions without necessarily there being organic life, and by introducing organic life, you're inevitably changing those conditions or those natural structures, and so people who assign value to that would be concerned about directed panspermia. And yeah, I guess it kind of it depends on your value system, but yeah.
Yeah. So on balance, I guess if you let's say removing the precautionary principle, if we can do that. So maybe if you could have a perfect kill switch, you could launch directed pansperms now, but have a kill switch and fully control that for the future. That's my way of trying to remove that as a concern. The precautionary principle. Would you say that directed panspermia would be on balance good or bad, ethically speaking?
Yeah, so I mean, we'd have to, I guess, like posit a very different universe where this isn't a concern because
Yeah.
even with the kill switch, it could malfunction or all sorts of different things
Yeah.
could happen. But yeah, if we always have the optionality of stopping the pansperms en route to their intended destinations, um, I think I would still be against it purely from the sake of just like I prefer to wait until we have more information and better models of things that matter, of things that are correlated with value. And I feel like we still don't have that. So I'm kind of still, would have some reservations about it. I think, as I mentioned before, Anders is, he's not in favor of it now because we've written this paper and we have this argument. But I think that if there was that option available, he would be pro spreading life. Yeah,
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
unclear.
All right. So I mean, if someone this will, we'll go back to now the millionaire or billionaire you were mentioning earlier who is already thinking about doing this. If someone wanted to start launching directed panspermia now, or get the technology ready where they could do that, and they're convinced they're not convinced that they should wait. They're convinced that they should do this as soon as possible. Is there any reasonable way to stop them? Any legal measures? And just for a bit more background on my thinking on this, and I know we've talked about this before. I've been a bit concerned about messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, or METI, which we've already done a few times as a species. We've started to send signals into space, kind of with the intention of them being received, and maybe with the receiver being able to work out where the message was sent from. It's not we're not hiding that. I think maybe even encouraging that with those messages. This these are it's a pretty feels like a pretty important decision that most of other people, multiple people, should have to agree on. Maybe it affects everyone on Earth, but not everyone on Earth has agreed about this. If someone wants to send a message into space, they can do that. It's pretty hard to stop them. They don't need that many people to agree. They might just need some research funding and access to a radio telescope or something.
Yeah.
So it we can't stop them if we wanted to. Is the same true for directed panspermia? And are there any legal measures that could be implemented that would stop? Might apply for directed panspermia, but it might apply for things like messaging extraterrestrial intelligence as well, and anything else that more people should maybe have a say on.
Yeah, no, that reminds me of I just finished reading the three body problem, and that's obviously a big concern in that book. As for directed panspermia, in the process of doing research for writing this paper, I was actually surprised at how poor the state of kind of uh, terrestrial coordination around these kinds of issues is. So I think directed panspermia would be more difficult than somebody wanting to send a message, just because it's, I mean, once someone sent the message, obviously we can, we have, theoretically we would have detection equipment that would allow us to locate them and maybe stop them from doing that. Although to my knowledge there isn't like an active kind of policing of these kinds of activities. With directed panspermia, I guess maybe we would have the capacity to sense, depending on the size of the payload, what's being shot out into space. And maybe we could do something like that again. Maybe it's less concerning for each individual instance because, as I mentioned before, each instance probably has like quite a low chance of succeeding. And, in order to make this viable, you would just need to attempt directed panspermia, potentially thousands or millions of times. Um, but yeah, I was surprised that there isn't really that much of a there aren't mechanisms in place, or there aren't like there are some kind of like multilateral agreements between different countries, but then they're constantly being broken. Like all sorts of or all manner of matter has been sent into space already, including telescopes and a bunch of other things that haven't been authorized, and there haven't been any punitive measures. So yeah, a big part of writing this paper was actually kind of addressing the problem of human coordination around this issue, which definitely overlaps with messaging, potential extraterrestrial life.
Yeah, and what did you come up with? I think a moratorium was maybe proposed as a potential solution. What are your thoughts on solving this?
Yeah. I think like it's kind of a brute mechanism in order to reduce the likelihood, but really it's like all we could think of because there isn't already infrastructure. I mean, maybe in the future if we had more, kind of a more developed kind of like coordination system where different scientists or different actors who want to influence or conduct activities in outer space where they could actually coordinate around these issues, then maybe this we could withdraw the moratorium, or we could permit some activities, like we talked about also in the paper, creating like a life hand, like a system that would detect a potentially imminent existential risk and then spread life to address the concern of extinction risk. So stuff like this could in principle happen, but for the time being, given that there isn't that system in place to be able to coordinate human actions, we think it is prudent to impose a moratorium and to get as much agreement as possible. I know that there's also discussion about this happening in other areas relating to outer space activity. And so I feel like there is actually, it's not just this issue. There's lots of concerns as the cost of space access has plummeted by, I think, a factor of 18 in the last decade alone. And so, increasingly this is something that's being, in not only the minds of people who are doing research in outer space, but also members of the public and politicians and whatnot. So, yeah, establish a moratorium and then also use that moratorium as an opportunity to create those coordination systems, to have dialogue, and to actually weigh up the values rather than just having a rogue actor kind of acting independently. And then you have a situation that kind of resembles the unilateralist cursed scenarios that Anders written about in the past, where all it takes is one rogue agent to make a decision, and then it has consequences for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even letting aside, directed panspermia and METI, it plausibly only takes one actor to instigate a global nuclear war, depending on how much power they have.
Yeah.
So, this is a pervasive problem that affects a lot of different things. So, I think finding better ways of coordinating and solving that problem seems really important.
Yeah, yeah, and it's obviously evidenced by the fact that, for the last 50, 60, or however long years, there's been so much resources, or so many people have devoted their lives to reducing the likelihood of one rogue actor acting in this way. I mean, the threat of nuclear war is like very apparent and very intuitive and easy to grok because, we've seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki and other instances of nuclear related disasters. The threat of panspermia, directed panspermia, is invisible for the very fact that it will take tens, potentially hundreds of millions of years to have an effect. And so obviously none of us are going to be around to see the potential consequences, whether or not they'll be positive or negative depending on your value system. But if it is negative, and especially if it's negative at an astronomical level, then yeah, we should really take this seriously. I would argue equally, if not more seriously, as nuclear, coordination around preventing nuclear risks. So
Yeah, yeah. How does directed panspermia stack up relative to other ways of potentially seeding the universe with sentience? I mean, the other one I can think of, I guess, is seeding digital sentience throughout the universe, maybe through von Neumann probes or something. Um, does what I mean, both in terms of the risk and also just as a practical means of preserving sentience, if that is what you want to do. Does one seem better or easier or more robust than the
yeah,
other?
that's a fascinating question, and I have two responses to that. So one is my own view. So I'm a physicalist about consciousness, which means I basically think that subjective experience is kind of a substrate specific property of physical systems, which would essentially mean that if we want to replicate sentience throughout the cosmos, the best we could do is send systems that carry a blueprint for creating sentient systems to other planets, and then those systems would, kind of like in a kind of predictable manner, um, you know, extract resources and build sentient systems. But that's kind of, that seems like not so much of a risk at this stage, given that we, assuming that consciousness is a physical entity, we don't know what physical entity it is, and we don't know what are the necessary conditions to be able to create sentient systems under this conception. So I'd say the risk is quite low, according to physicalist conceptions of phenomenal consciousness. But if we take computationalism as an ontological assumption for what consciousness is, then I guess you could split this possibility into two branches. One of them would be, well, depending on what kind of informational pattern a computationalist would identify the entity of phenomenal consciousness with, it could be that there are already patterns that are ubiquitous throughout the physical universe that are identical to kind of valence patterns like suffering patterns. So Brian Tomasic has also written about this, and that's kind of a pan-computationalist, pan-psychist kind of view, which would say that, well, actually physical processes already encode valence functions, and so there's already suffering and pleasure that's just baked into the universe or how physical processes unfold. And then a second view would be, well, no, we need certain types of systems that are capable of instantiating the computations that are like necessary and sufficient for consciousness. And if you have that view, then maybe you also need a system that is capable, that carries a blueprint that's capable of, say, building a Turing machine or building whatever kind of information processing system is capable of like instantiating these computations. But yeah, there's the possibility space is actually much larger than this, but
Yeah.
I'm kind of compressing it to give you an idea of the how it could unfold. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Where I mean, first of all, is there anything that you'd like to add before we start to wrap up? Any other things that you think are important considerations that people should be thinking about on this topic?
Yeah, so I would kind of just add that, I think this is an important issue to work on. It's unclear exactly, what kinds of advocacy work is going to be impactful toward, like reducing the risk or just making this issue more tractable. At the moment, I think it has to do, with coordination. And so I'm currently strategizing, potential modes of coordinating people who care about this or coordinating governments or research institutions to take a stance against this or prevent it from happening without widespread agreement. So yeah, if anyone has any great ideas or would like to reach out and collaborate with me on that, then you can definitely find my contact info. I'd love to hear it because I think it's really important. Um, but yeah, also the view that I expressed, which is my own view, is that the precautionary principle, we just don't know enough about the dynamics of well-being or what consciousness or sentience are in order to reasonably predict how it would unfold on exoplanets. And so given that, I would just really encourage people to consider how can we, I guess, advance the research field of it's been proposed as welfare biology or just like studying the dynamics of well-being in nature. If you're interested in that or that question, I've just written a PhD thesis that's over 200 pages, and I'm probably going to publish it on my blog, which is arataki.me. So I'll also include a link, so you could read that and reach out to me about that if you're interested.
Yeah, cool. We'll definitely have a link to that. And congrats on getting that thesis done. And hope the final revision process is not too extensive.
Yeah, no, thanks. Hopefully, I'll submit by the end of the month. That's my deadline. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. And I think you've mentioned a few resources, but where else should people look if they want to dive a little bit deeper in this topic, or maybe give like an intro, medium, and in depth next step for someone.
Yeah. So I guess the paper that we wrote, Anders and I, so that's currently under review at Acta Astronautica and will hopefully be published in the next few months. We're just doing some minor revisions. I also have a preprint, so if at the time this is published, it's not available, you can just email me and I'll send you the preprint. And then some names that we've already mentioned, Brian Tomasek has written and spoken about this in the past. I think he's one of the first people to really make the point about natural suffering being a potential concern, or a consequence of these activities. But then there's also Gary O'Brien. He writes a lot about animal ethics and long-termism. He's written a paper, The Ethics of World Creation, which really delves into this and was one of the inspirations actually for the paper, because when I was visiting Oxford, we were studying at the same centre, so we got to have a lot of productive discussions about it. And then, as I mentioned before as well, Oskari Sevilla has written in a kind of more environmentalist or ecocentric and biocentric perspective, looking at the possibility space of, is this good or bad? So would recommend checking out his paper as well.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thanks for that, and very nice to chat with you, Asher. Thanks for coming to share your expertise about this topic.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on.